I'm gonna catch my breath for a second. All right. Forget about the books. Hello and welcome to Audrey Farmer's panel on her paper, Loving Your Enemies, the Power of Pity and Compassion in Crime and Punishment Until Leon Faces. I've had the immense honor of being her editor and advisor this year on her paper, and one of the first meetings that we had together, she said that she wanted to write on Svidrigailov, and I thought, who? That I read the book Crime and Punishment. I don't remember that character, and I think it's pretty telling about the way that Audrey looks at life, and Audrey looks at humanity in this way that she sees the people that other people miss, the people who are kind of background characters, and she sees them and she has compassion on them and she wants to know more about them. And just her approach to this book kind of convicted me and made me think about the way that I love people and the way that I view people, their significance and who they are as people. So I just had a blast talking about these books, thinking through ideas, arguing, finishing each other's sentences, and I'm so excited to hear from her. So welcome, Audrey.
So I just want to say a quick thank you to Ms. Roeger and everyone else who's here to support me. I care so much about these books and these characters, and it's really excited to be able to share my year's work with all of you. So I'd like to begin by talking about Crime and Punishment, which follows Raskolnikov, the murderer. Dostoevsky allows the reader to specifically delve into Raskolnikov's mind as he struggles with his grief and confusion after he commits his crime. Along the way, Raskolnikov becomes acquainted with a young lady by the name of Sonia, who's a prostitute, and she works to support her impoverished family. In the background, we have the character Svidrigailov, who is essentially portrayed as a one-dimensional evil character. And he's portrayed this way. I remember when we first read this part, people fell into two categories. People either felt like he deserved it or didn't really feel much at all, or there are people who fell into the category of pitying him. And for me, I fell into the latter category. But this kind of disturbed me, this kind of upset me, in that I was pitying such a horrible person. And so this raised the question for me, what brings one to pity an evil person? So in my essay, I define pity as a feeling that stems from grief upon seeing the suffering of others. The one pitying shares in the pain of the one being pitied. So I'd like to redirect this to an analysis of how men fall into their state of sin, because I think it's important to see people not simply as just sin, and it's necessary to become acquainted with their whole story as much as possible in order to judge them and their story correctly. So in my essay, I talk about how there's this sort of cycle that both Svidrigailov and Raskolnikov find themselves in. Both men are initially isolated from society, and then this leads them to lie to themselves, and then they act violently because, well, basically because of these lies. They think that they're superior, and they think they found some sort of a loophole in society that allows them to act in whatever way they deem appropriate. And then after their acts of violence, they end up more confused in the end, and then the cycle continues as they are further isolated from society. And thus, by looking at this cycle between Raskolnikov and Svidrigailov, it's easy to see how their sin is something that's that they're very closely connected, and that these cycles are actually something that most people, specifically these characters, can identify with, and it's not something that's necessarily unique to one or the other. And something else that I identified was that this cycle feeds on itself, and that it oftentimes takes an outside force to break this cycle, which I identify as the pity that I defined earlier. But then I go into the idea of compassion, which pity leads into, and I define compassion as the way in which one acts upon this feeling of pity out of love for the other, taking on the burdens of others and investing yourself in another's salvation. In this case, Sonia acts out of compassion by redirecting Raskolnikov towards the truth, away from sort of the way in which he was lying to himself previously. In order to do this, I say you must humanize the sinner, or you must humanize this other person who is struggling. It's necessary for you to see yourself in them, and then you also, in turn, have to identify their sin. So you end up comparing your sin to their sin. This cycle, while it varies depending on the nature of the sin itself or the mentality of the sinner, is, like I said, something that's very relatable. Sonia and Raskolnikov choose each other because they see both the good and the bad in one another. And in turn, they understand each other's respective sin. In their first meeting, Raskolnikov says, quote, "We're cursed together." And then later on tells her, "I have chosen you." And then in the second meeting, Sonia tells Raskolnikov, "We shall bear this cross together." So even though Sonia is a prostitute, Raskolnikov sees that she still has hope. And therefore, he sees that hope is possible for himself as well. Going back to Svidrigailov, the thing is about Svidrigailov is that we don't know what would have happened to him if there was the intervention of a caring individual. He could have taken it sort of how Raskolnikov does, or he could have left it and just simply ended up the same way that he did. The point is that we don't know. Svidrigailov and Raskolnikov are very similar, but they end up on different courses because Raskolnikov has Sonia and Svidrigailov does not. So skipping to Tilly of Faces. Tilly of Faces follows the story of Arul, the eldest of three princesses. She is the daughter of Trom, king of Glom, and seeks to write her story, which is essentially the book Tilly of Faces. That's her account against the gods. So she starts from her youth, and Auril explains that she is the ugly one amongst her two supremely beautiful sisters. One is Radoval, the cunning, sort of seductive character, and Psyche is the pure-hearted. She specifically says, quote, "She made beauty all around her." As terrible things begin to occur in the kingdom, the priest announces that there is, quote, the accursed residing in Rome, and that in order to return to peace, they must be sacrificed to the god of the mountain. The cursed is revealed to be Psyche, who is the sister who Auril loves the most. The rest of Auril's account against the gods details her grief upon losing her sister, and then her eventual reign as queen. Towards the end of her reign, Auril comes across a priest's hut. When she asks who the temple is for, he says it's for Psyche. He begins to tell the story of Psyche's sacrifice and her role as a goddess. And Auril notes how the story has been told hideously wrong. Auril and Radoval are seen as aggressors in this story, which Auril absolutely despises. She says, quote, "He was telling it wrong, hideously and stupidly wrong. It was as if the gods themselves had first laughed and then spat in my face, as if you told a cripple's story and never said he was lame." In this moment, Auril learns the value of the whole story. She is judged unfairly in this situation because she is judged unfairly, and then in turn, she learns how easily falsehoods spread and how people in turn religiously, in this case literally, religiously devote themselves to them. She herself has judged many of those around her, sometimes correctly and sometimes incorrectly, including her father and her two sisters. She's even angry towards the fox at one point, which she which she considers to be sort of a grandfather figure to her, one of the people who she actually loves, I would say. And she says, well, he decides to leave the conversation after a long day. And then she goes as far as to say, quote, "This is where men, even the trustiest, fail us. Everyone goes for me. None of them cares for Psyche. She lives at the very outskirts of their thoughts." So here in this hut, we see how Orul, who is very much a relatable character, comes to grips with her own bias. Similar to how the priest has bias against her, Orul has bias against others, and then that leads her to also treat them unfairly. She's able to look in the situation from the outside and then see the value of the truth. And this relates to us because we don't know the intricacies of each other's stories. We do know that we all have good and bad, and therefore we all have the potential for redemption. So understanding the whole of someone's story opens up this opportunity for pity and compassion, which in turn has the ability to actualize this potential for redemption. However, we often fall into Orul's view of the world. She's an extremely relatable character, but the problem with this is that it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help ourselves, and then it doesn't help the people around us. So I like to sort of conclude with a final image that I didn't include in my essay, but I think really summarizes my paper well. Orul's father, once again a man known for his anger, shows Orul her reflection in the great mirror, and she describes this mirror. "Our common mirrors were false and dull. In this, you could see your perfect image." So the king decides to show Orul her ugliness because she's known to be the ugly sister. This is in stark contrast to the end of the story where Orul is awaiting her judgment from the gods. And while waiting, the spirit of the fox shows her a series of murals on the wall. And they reveal the way in which Orul had been taking on the sufferings of Psyche. After the fox shows her these images, she says, quote, "Oh, I give thanks, I bless the gods," which is surprising because this directly contrasts with the way in which she had so strongly condemned the gods to begin with, hence her writing her whole, that Orul truly changes for the better. Both the fox and the king show her some aspects of reality, but the fox is distinct in this way. She realizes her own faults, and then she begins to subordinate herself to the gods, who she has apparently wrongly accused, which she now realizes. The king only brings negativity, and therefore he in essence stunts Orul's growth. So we shouldn't let our pride get in the way of helping those around us. And that's because these are problems that we all universally face. So I conclude my essay talking about this, and I just wanted to leave with a quote from my essay, the very end. I say, quote, "It is necessary that one makes a personal connection to the sins of others, because men do not have the luxury of addressing their own sins exclusively. It is not a question of us against them. Man as a whole disobeys the commandments of God and perverts the good. It is more constructive to address man's problems as a whole. It is not always best to give someone what is due, but to walk with them towards salvation." Thank you.
You gonna take the first question?
Audrey, first of all, I just want to thank you for the privilege of being able to read this paper, and then having read other works of yours from last year and having you in class. I think that just this has really played to your strengths, and I just see some of the best quality that I've seen from you. So what a great culmination, and we're excited for the hour ahead. With that said, too, and I also I couldn't write fast enough when you were defining pity and compassion. And I know you have it several places here in your essay, but I noticed that you used the word pity 26 times in your paper, and compassion was used 6 times. And mercy was not in the paper at all. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more as you began to in your presentation about how pity turns into compassion, or if there's anywhere you want to point to, but then also what is the role of mercy when we take pity on someone or when we are compassionate towards someone?
Yeah, so maybe an explanation for why there are more instances where I use pity than compassion might be because, both are very difficult, but it seems as though, or how I've defined pity and compassion is that compassion comes from pity. And so it might be more easy to have a feeling of pity towards someone, but then maybe not act upon it, because I define sort of pity as like that sort of like that gut feeling when you see someone struggling, and then you feel bad because you're like, well, what if I were in that situation? But compassion is sort of like the actually acting upon that feeling of pity.
Yeah, on page, at least in my copy, I think my numbers are off. Mine is page 17, where you say compassion is the desire to act upon this feeling of pity out of love for the other.
Yeah.
So is action, is it simply desire, or does an action have to take place in order to be compassionate?
So I think that there is a certain amount of action that is contained within desire. So if we're defining mercy from here, mercy might be furthermore defining it like by an action. But yeah, so I think the desire is kind of tied into the action, if that answers your question.
In discussing which one?
The definition of compassion.
Of compassion.
Yeah.
So if I have this rightly, so maybe this is not the most technical way to put it, but pity is more of a feeling and spontaneously arising in an individual? Okay.
Yeah.
And then compassion is what is actively chosen out of love for the other to act on that pity?
Yeah, so I think, taking the example of Raskolnikov and Sonia, I think pity would be sort of that gut feeling that Sonia has when he first tells her that he's a murderer, and like when he takes her hands and she says like, what have you done to yourself? But then the act of sort of like compassion would be sort of like her stepping with him the whole way, like even when it's most difficult, like when he rejects her when he's in prison, and so like how she continues to stand with him. That would be more of the idea of compassion. And then mercy would be sort of tied into that, where it's like because she's having mercy on him through compassion.
It seems like mercy entails a wrongdoing.
Yeah.
Right? If you're talking about giving mercy to someone, it's maybe there's been a wrong that's done to you, and you're overlooking that. Whereas the others don't necessarily have to have. You think of Raskolnikov and Sonia, they can have pity and compassion on each other's situations, even though they haven't wronged each other.
Yeah.
Do we see instances of mercy, or is that just kind of beyond the scope of what you were?
Yeah, actually. So I think I actually talked with you about this, Mrs. Thorpe, a little bit. Sort of maybe there's some sort of hierarchy there going on when we're talking about mercy. So sort of like someone having mercy on a lower person, or someone who has the authority to inflict punishment on someone else.
Like a judge could have mercy on a
person. I'm sorry, there was a second half of that question that I'm forgetting. or the second half of that.
I was just wondering about examples.
Yeah, so maybe the reason why I don't bring it up in this paper is because I'm mainly talking about the relationship between man and man.
Mm-hmm.
In that, in the case of like Raskolnikov and Sonia, they haven't done anything wrong to each other per se,
Mm-hmm.
but it's more of just like this general feeling of like, I relate to you.
Yeah.
And we've both done bad things to other people. And then maybe out of that, they act out of compassion.
So I have a really, I think, an important question then
Mm-hmm.
about pity, and this goes back to the anecdote you gave during your talk about some people in your class had pity on Sergei and some people didn't.
Yeah.
What do you think accounts for that?
Yeah.
Because you had mentioned it is something that you are kind of arises within you spontaneously.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that people that have pity do to cultivate that? And is it you have it or you don't?
Yeah.
How do you think of that?
See, something that I was sort of in the background struggling with was the relationship between pity and justice, because it seems like also justice is a good thing. So I think in this case with Sergei, people felt those two categories were formed by, okay, this is something that's happening that's sort of like just, like this is something that he was an awful person, he deserved it. Like I don't feel pity for him because this is something that he's earned.
Mm-hmm.
But then maybe the category of people who pitied him, maybe they recognize sort of, I guess, the justice of a situation, but there's something further than that, which is sort of like, well, identifying with this process of sin, or like this cycle of sin, and being like, well, I mean, if I fall into this sort of cycle of sin, then like, how do I relate to that?
Yeah. So you're saying then, let's take Sonia, for instance. Sonia can have both pity and compassion because of something she realizes about herself.
Yeah, I think so. So actually in their very first meeting, Raskolnikov notes how it's Raskolnikov who makes this realization, not Sonia, but I think it still pertains, where Raskolnikov says, like, you've defiled yourself, you've essentially taken your own life. And then meeting, when she gives the cross to him and said, like, we will bear the cross together, sort of that, I think within herself and within Raskolnikov as well, they don't see each other as any different when they're looking at their sins.
You mentioned justice. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit. What's fascinating to me is I think you do a good job highlighting the pity and compassion that especially Sonia has for Raskolnikov, but she also makes him fess up. Yeah. So there is a justice component in this too. It's not just all love and compassion.
So I think I kind of addressed this towards the end. So I talk about how essentially like justice is good, but when weighing what is most beneficial or what is best for a person, when we're talking about justice, it's more of like I feel like it almost has like more of a, I don't want to say a short-term effect, but compassion. I talk about how compassion offers hope for that person, and it may be that justice is sort of playing into the sort of like hope for Raskolnikov, in that he's able to, when he goes through sort of like the process of going to jail, and then I think that almost brings him towards his salvation. And I don't know, I think there's a certain aspect of it that Sonia realizes that, where she says that like he's confessing his sins to both God and Porfiry. And there's something similar that's happening there.
So in other words, you're saying, in your view, there's something more harmonious about, because I think we can often think of justice as being antithetical to those realities of pity and compassion, but you're saying, as far as crime and punishment is concerned, maybe those things are more harmonious.
Yeah, and it might be more situational as well, where in this case, the fact that he was able to go through the process of justly, going through this process, that he was able to have hope in the end. But I think we can consider other situations where maybe that isn't the case, where justice is being employed, but it doesn't necessarily offer that hope for that person. But I guess in this case, they aren't antithetical to one another.
I do have a lot of other questions, but I don't want to monopolize the time.
I think you could say that maybe Svetoslav end could be justice in a sense, that because of his crimes, and you stated them, we think based on the book that he beat his wife to death. He attempts to rape someone, and he goes through multiple sins. So his end could be justice in a sense.
Yeah.
But Raskolnikov serves a different kind of justice, still state-employed justice, but that it's different because of the people involved. As far as Sonia's there with him, I think that makes me think of Aurora. Is there a way that Aurora pays for her sin? Does she pay for her sin? Is there justice for her?
I think to a certain extent, yes. Just because, I mean, throughout her life, I think there's a certain amount of toll that hating everyone around you takes on yourself. And I think we see that with the rule, where she essentially puts her whole being into this book. And then when she reads it out to the gods at the end, she realizes how low it is and how base it is. And she's essentially hated all these people, I would say almost for nothing. She's just a very angry person. And I think she does that to herself. So there's a certain aspect of she's hating somebody. And then in turn, there's this almost self-hatred that comes out of it. Because I don't think that, she doesn't necessarily love herself either. The fact that, just the way that she treats herself. So I think there is a certain amount of justice that occurs there. But then once again, there's the mercy of the gods at the end, that in the end, what was the fox? She asked the fox, are the gods just? And he said something like, thank goodness they aren't, because if they were, then you would essentially be in a lot of trouble right now.
Yeah.
I think there's a certain amount of internal justice that happens with her, but in the end, she also still experiences mercy.
I think when we were talking about it, through the process, I was considering that that a rule rescues or saves Psyche, because Psyche is the one wandering around, divorced from her husband for a time, and that Aurora does the work to bring Psyche to become a goddess.
Yeah.
But reading your paper just this last time, I was wondering, does Psyche save Aurora, or does Aurora save Psyche?
Yeah, I think that there's a certain aspect. I don't think that's mutually exclusive. I think that they can also save each other. Aurora, when she's taking on Psyche's burdens and making it easier for her, there's definitely that process of saving her. But then at the end, I feel like there's that sort of part of Psyche's a goddess at the end, and there's a certain amount of she has there's a certain amount of pity that Psyche has on Aurora, where she sort of sees her as this lowly figure, and Aurora's bowing down to Psyche. And then she has mercy on her and says, the god of the mountain is coming to judge you. I don't even, that's probably not even mercy. But I think there's a certain element to it that Psyche does, in a sense, save Aurora. And I'm just having trouble putting that into words, I guess. maybe it's because she's such a loving character that for Arul to hang on to that might be just that presence might be something that's that saves her. I'm not quite sure.
But there seems to be a process of redemption. And
Mhm.
when you talk about Sonia walks beside Raskolnikov toward redemption. You say that a couple times. So is there a process in which Psyche allows or helps Arul with her own redemption? How is Arul redeemed? Because we could also have a book that ends where Arul is a bitter old lady who is stuck inside herself, and she's the queen and no longer Arul, and she dies and she's angry at the gods and she's ugly. We could have a story like that, but it doesn't end there. So what is the process in your mind of how she's redeemed, how she gets a happy ending?
Yeah, actually, can I add to that? Because I think I'm curious about that's kind of the falling action, but I'm curious about the rising action, like how she got to be that way. Because you I think spell it really clearly and thoroughly the way Raskolnikov kind of inch by inch that way. So I think it'd be nice to kind of see that whole arc in Arul.
Yeah. So with Arul, I think she feels that sort of that same isolation from society from a very young age. Because she knows that she's the ugly sister. I think I mentioned in my essay the very beginning when their mother dies and they're cutting their hair as a sign of mourning. And she notes how how Redoval, they're mourning Redoval's golden locks. And then there's a moment when her father's getting remarried when he suggests that they all wear veils, and then the one of the other girls sort of laughs at her because they're trying to sort of cover up how ugly she is. So I think from the very beginning, there's a sort of resentment Arul has this sort of resentment towards society or resentment towards others because she is also isolated. But I think she's also surrounded by people. She's surrounded by some good people like the fox and around Psyche. But then she's also surrounded by people like the king, and where maybe everyone isn't so great. And then I think there is sort of I think once again I think this cycle is something that is very relatable in that I think she follows almost the same arc where she in essence kind of lies to herself about those around her and about herself, that she's the pitiable one, that she's the victim because all these things have happened to her. And then in turn, this act of violence may not be like murdering like Raskolnikov, but it's sort of like this act of hatred towards other people that might be the case in this situation. And then I think she also just ends up more confused in the end and more self-loathing and more she doesn't have the gods to turn to. She doesn't have any family to turn to. So I think that in the end, this arc is something that's very similar between Crime and Punishment and Story Faces.
But I wonder, maybe I'll start with the more personal side of the question. Does Arul or Raskolnikov elicit more pity from you? I'm just, and seeing the contrast together, I find myself, I think I pity on both of them, but I think it comes about more for me with Arul, and it seems like a lot more has happened to her in some ways than Raskolnikov, and there's a lot more intentionality that I see, and they both have problems, but it's sort of, I don't know, how do you work through that, if you had to, in a scale or something, away them?
I think definitely the intentionality plays a lot into it, like you said, that more stuff happens to Arul, and then Raskolnikov, I feel like a lot of his problems are sort of self-initiated, the isolation of society. Like there is sort of like that outside people tend to reject him, but then he also rejects most people in general.
Even what you said about the isolation, right? Is that Raskolnikov is the cause of the isolation. Arul is just ugly.
Yeah, and then she even, I think at one point she talks about how she is sort of like cursed by the gods in that sense.
Yeah.
Like, and that's why she's writing her account against the gods, is because she thinks she's the victim of the gods and that they have decided that she just is going to have an awful life. But then something that I talked to Miss Roiger about as well is just how relatable Aurora is. Like she just feels like someone that you would meet, or I mean, for me, I guess someone that I would identify with almost more than Raskolnikov the murderer. Just that, like, Aurora goes through this, I guess, this sort of cycle of like just little things happening to her and then getting on her nerves and then just sort of like building up resentment towards certain people, I guess. Or I feel like that's just sort of like how those things happen on such a small level. I feel like it's something that's also very relatable.
There did seem to be some choice though involved after that. What you say on, I think it's your second page of your thesis. I feel like there's two sentences you have here where I could substitute Raskolnikov's name and put Aurora's name here. The first is in talking about clothing. With this indicates how Raskolnikov, by simply presenting himself in rags, is perceived as distinct and isolated from those around him, almost subhuman. And then further down, Raskolnikov's odd appearance naturally catches the eye of the public and receives ridicule. We're going to keep going. By presenting himself in a way that is not socially acceptable, it becomes obvious how, from even a glance, Raskolnikov is detached from the rest of society. I thought it was really interesting how you noted small details like clothing and also where he chooses to live. But after Psyche is taken and sacrificed, there's also a choice that she makes with deciding what she wears and how she isolates herself from society.
Yeah. And then actually, I think that's really interesting because we have like sort of the outside interpretation of what Raskolnikov's wearing. But then you also have people there's like a guessing game as to what's underneath Aurora's veil.
Yeah.
And sort of like people assume so much about her. People will say people assume incorrectly as well. They say that she's probably the most beautiful woman because of her beautiful voice.
Yeah, to quote you, back to you, almost subhuman.
Yeah. Definitely. So, I mean, yeah, I definitely think that's interesting. I think that they, once again, with this sort of arc, I think the main things that come from this arc are just simply that isolation from society, and then the idea that there's some sort of like superiority, or the idea of like lying to yourself. I think because in both cases you see sort of this like the temptation to murder or the temptation to hate others, and I think temptation feeds off of that sort of blinding of reality, or sort of like a corruption of the will that is so I guess so connected to that process of lying to yourselves, that which comes about because of that isolation from society.
So there is that idea about lies and what we do when we receive them, but then also what about stories and how we receive them? Because you mentioned in your paper and in your presentation that Aurora is not very happy about the story she hears about her sister. But then also Raskolnikov, he wants to hear the story of Lazarus from Sonia. So what about stories and how that affects that arc and also just how we perceive things?
Yeah, so this is actually kind of where I started my paper, is because I wanted to write about sort of like the process of untold stories. And something, I guess the reason why Svidrigailov struck me so much as a character is because you hate him so much, and really you only catch glimpses of just how awful he is, and in the end he kills himself, and then you're confused. And because I mean, with how Dostoevsky writes, he writes so intentionally that I don't think he would just throw in a character that you're just meant to hate, and then just for the heck of you hating it. And I think that was sort of the process for me of like going back into the text and trying to rationalize that, because it sort of shook me so much. So when I was going back in Crime and Punishment, I sort of realized the way in which Dostoevsky was essentially manipulating the reader And it's kind of, I guess it's almost kind of a bold claim to say that the author is manipulating the reader. But, but I think what he was doing is, I think he intended to draw a comparison between Svidrigailov and Raskolnikov, in that, in essence, if you really pay attention to Svidrigailov's story or really delve into his character in general, you notice the similarities in their art.
Mm-hmm.
But the first time you read it through, you really only see those awful parts. So I think even Dostoevsky, in his writing of the book, is almost trying to elicit those feelings in you of like, maybe there's more to this story that I have to go back and look at.
Mm-hmm.
And then that was almost like the process of me having to go back and look at this person's story more. But then, and then it's something very similar, I think, with Orul when she's hearing the story at the end. And she's realizing how stories can be corrupted or changed. I think she says something along the lines of, are all sort of stories like this? Like, or even like stories that people religiously devote themselves to specifically. Like, are they all representations in this way of sort of falsehoods? Or it makes her just question things in general, like how people tell stories or how people perceive those stories in turn.
Mm-hmm.
Where I think, connecting it back to the story of Lazarus, I think that in that case, if they know this, if we're assuming that Sonia and Raskolnikov know this story to be true, there's a certain amount of power that comes from that. And then they're able to gain hope from that for themselves because they know it to be true.
Yeah, it's interesting with, at the end of Crime and Punishment, when you're in the epilogue, Raskolnikov has 7 more years to serve in prison. And so what he has underneath his pillow in prison is the Gospels. And on the second to last page says that that the book belonged to her. It was the same one from which she had read to him about the raising of Lazarus. And it continues on, but in some ways is Raskolnikov trying to imitate that story?
Yeah,
to come back to life?
There's a certain, oh my gosh, I love that part because I really liked that part because I felt like it was almost a piece of, in sort of, in essence, sort of colloquially, she's like rooting him on. But I think that that's why that story intrigues him so much, because I think throughout the text, at one point, people question him and ask him if he believes in God. And then he'll say no, but then he'll say that he believes in like a real Lazarus. And like, that's really strange, where he's struggling with the idea of God. But then he, I guess if we're taking this sort of metaphorically, sort of a rebirth or a re-beginning, or in his sense, sort of like a spiritual resurrection, or in that case, I think he is in essence trying to imitate that story of Lazarus, because I think he almost sees the light at the end of the tunnel. And in that moment, like at the end, I'm looking at the page again towards the end, when he reunites with Sonia. Previously, it was said that he possibly does not have the ability to love people anymore. But then it says how it happened, he did not know, but suddenly it was as something lifted him and flung him down at her feet. He wept and embraced her knees. For the first moment, she was terribly frightened and her whole face went numb. She jumped up and looked at him, trembling, but all at once in that same moment, she understood everything. Infinite happiness lit up her eyes. She understood, and for her, there was no longer any doubt that he loved her infinitely, and that was the last moment had come. So I think she realizes that this change is happening in Raskolnikov, and for him, I think he's also recognizing that there is the potential for him to redeem himself.
My next question is going to move us off of that topic so I can hold on to it. Okay. So I had a question about his friend Razumikin and why, because it seems like you talked about relationships, either family relationships or a romantic relationship, whether Raskolnikov and Sonia started as a romantic relationship or not. I still don't understand the relationship, so we'll just assume it's romantic. But what about other relationships? Is it possible for a friend, just a everyday Razumikin, to influence and to walk alongside toward redemption as well? Why? So the question is, why did he have the same effect that Sonia did on Raskolnikov?
Why did he have the same effect?
Why didn't he?
I think it was. I mean, there's a certain aspect of it where Razumikin does invest in Raskolnikov, and in my essay, I specifically note how he gives him the clothes, and that maybe he can present yourself as sort of more of a gentleman as opposed to the rags that you're in. I think also Razumikin has the potential to really help Raskolnikov. Once again, is that he's more looking on the outside. It's like, oh, you love your family. Like, isn't that such a bad thing? Rather than concerned with like what might be behind that. Where I think Sonia is more invested in that sense. Where I think Razumikin is more looking at sort of his outward transgressions, or sort of like the way, like, that's not socially acceptable. Like, you can't do that. But maybe not looking so deep as Sonia. And the way, so I think the way that Sonia invests herself in Raskolnikov is very different, but he still has the potential to really help Raskolnikov.
Follow-up question. Why does Raskolnikov decide to tell Sonia and not anyone else?
Okay, so I remember when we first read this in 10th grade that we had like a whole seminar on this. I think it's the certain aspect of what I was talking about previously, where he sees that she has done this to herself, and then in essence, sort of like, I think he almost sees that as almost equivalent to his murder, in that she has, in a sense, taken her own life, or taken this very important part of her life and sacrificed it. And I think Raskolnikov sees it as well, like he sacrificed part of himself to test his extraordinary man theory for the greater good. And of course, Sonia is doing it, say, for the greater good of her family. So I think the reason why he chooses Sonia is because I think it's once again that process of they see each other they see one another in each other. And Raskolnikov sees that Sonia is very similar to himself in that way.
So, second follow-up question. Is it possible to identify with someone who is so much worse than you? As far as, is it possible for someone who has not committed those crimes, right, and selling yourself into prostitution? Those seem extreme. Is it possible for a man like Razumikin to even identify? Is he, I mean,
like he's equipped to?
Yeah, he kind of seems a little silly, but nice, and that doesn't, and you know, like, what's his sin?
Yeah, I think we all have. I think the point of my essay is that, like, sort of like this cycle is something that the way that we get caught up in ourselves, in our own sin, and how we sort of treat other people, I think is something regardless of the extreme to which that occurs. So you can very much dislike somebody, and you could have someone who dislikes someone so much that they murder them, but this arc might be something that's very similar. So I think in that sense, all men, I think I have a line in here in my essay where I say that all men are particularly equipped to help one another because they do relate to this, to how sin comes about. But then also, maybe why Razumikin falls short is that Sonia understands Raskolnikov on a different level than maybe Razumikin does. Because she is on that extreme, that she understands the effect that something of this magnitude has on you. And I think it's something, there's also a line in Crime and Punishment where she understood sort of like the grief that came along with it. Maybe it was the other way around, that he understood her grief, something like that. But I think that magnitude of grief can only be truly understood by someone who has also experienced that magnitude of sin. So that might be why Razumikin falls short, but he still also has the potential to help.
But then, as a third follow-up question, you mentioned romantic loves and then familial loves, friendship love, but then your title.
Bingo.
Loving your enemies. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think the reason why I chose loving your enemies is because that's sort of like loving someone it is difficult to love. I guess you could almost say in the case of Raskolnikov and Sonia, Sonia should regard Raskolnikov as her enemy because he killed her best friend. And but then she ends up, and the part where she takes his hands was really special to me. I felt like that was particularly important because like these are literally the hands that killed her friend, and he's able to take his hands and say, like, what have you done to yourself? Mm-hmm. Like, we need to fix this together. And so I think the whole idea of loving your enemies comes from the idea that we have people around us doing awful things all the time. And we could even see people and that they sort of transgressed against humanity in general. And in turn, that makes it very difficult, makes them people that are very difficult to love. So in essence, it's sort of the most extreme example of loving someone when it's most difficult.
Yeah. You know, if we go back to the end of your paper that you read for us during your panel, you mentioned that it's not a question of us against them, and I think that's the idea of pity, loving your enemies. Mm-hmm. Do you think, though, that you talk about mankind as a whole, mm-hmm. And I think Ms. Roegler asked you, what do you do if, can someone who is maybe not as wicked kind of sympathize or have pity with another person who is? But I wonder if this only works, pity and compassion works with two people that are actually concerned about the good. Mm-hmm. And because your kind of paradigm is Raskolnikov and Sonia, and then Arul and Psyche. Yeah. And I wonder if, Svidrigailov doesn't really seem to care much about goodness or righteousness. And it seems like that might make it more difficult because someone who's struggling and failing, I think that elicits typically our pity a little bit more than someone who just, we wouldn't even say there's a struggle because they just are intentionally doing wicked.
Yeah.
Do you have thoughts just about that final kind of call at the end of your paper, us versus them? I see what you're saying in a human sense that no one was without, no one was without sin, cast the first stone. But then some people are actually seeking to better themselves, and some people have none of that.
Yeah, and I think I addressed this in my speech. I think the thing about Svidrigailov's story is that we don't know what would have happened if maybe he did have someone like Sonia. He could have either taken whatever that Sonia would have given him, whatever help, or he could have just left it and then ended up the same way that he did. And I think the point is that we don't know. Mm-hmm. And I think most people have a struggle with the good and the bad. I don't think people are just simply intending to do harm all the time, and they're just awful people. I think even with Svidrigailov, looking back at the story, we see glimpses of him being a good person. I think the part that stands out most to me is when he gives all of his money to Sonia's family to, I guess, to send them to the orphanage, but in turn, like freeing Sonia and then making sure that the children are taken care of after their parents die. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I think it all comes from perspective as well. It's like you could have a character like Svidrigailov and say that they are just always intentionally trying to create harm. Mm-hmm. But I think when we delve more into their story, we are able to see that struggle more, which is why we look at Raskolnikov and see that struggle more, where Dostoevsky, he shows glimpses of that side of Svidrigailov, but we don't really see much of it.
I mean, so your final line is about walking with people towards mm-hmm. salvation, and I wonder, are you willing to take that, even apply to Svidrigailov? That mm-hmm. that assumes kind of he's on a path.
Yeah,
right?
I think even just the idea that I pitied Svidrigailov, like I described, I think pity is like that initial gut feeling is that first step, mm-hmm. And I don't know if I would be so benevolent as to show compassion or walk with Svidrigailov in that situation. But I think the idea of Svidrigailov being on his path, I think we do see that in whatever glimpses that we do see of him. And that maybe if someone had walked with him, or maybe there would have been some sort of change.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we're at the time where we'll open it up for questions. We don't have a lot of time. I also wanted to say the dream.
Oh, yes.
Svidrigailov's dream. I'm going to just say that.
Yeah.
But do any of you have questions for Ms. Farmer?
Ms. Mahon? Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, is there somebody else?
No, go ahead.
All right. This was interesting because it's been a long time since I've read Crime and Punishment. But I had read an article on CNN about the Parkland shooter, mm-hmm. and there's a lot of people who are writing to him. There's a subset of those people that are just sick, right, mm-hmm. for what they're sending to him. But there are some people, they said in the article, that are writing to him because they feel sorry for him, so the pity and the compassion. Mm-hmm. But they then mention a group of people that are writing to him because they are vicariously living through him, right? Mm-hmm. And what he did. So my question is, was there anybody in these books, any of the characters that you read about that in these books that might be vicariously living through one of the people that were committing the crime?
Yeah, I mean, as in like they were inspired by them?
Yes.
Or like, are you saying that like doing the crime kind of through the person, not having to do it themselves?
Yes. And they were inspired by what they did. They saw them as the hero.
Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, I think that there's almost the person, I guess, that first comes to mind is the lawman, Porfiry, just because, not because he is living through Raskolnikov, but he's almost like feeding off of him and his own suffering and his own sin. And I remember even making the point, like when I first read this book, that Porfiry was just as bad, if not worse, than Svidrigailov. Like I absolutely hated him because I felt like he was sort of living off of Raskolnikov in that way. So I guess my gut, the person who I guess my mind goes to first would be Porfiry, not because he envies him or he wants to live through him, but just because he ends up doing that. Other than that, I don't really know of anybody, or nothing. No one else really comes to mind, I guess, that might apply to.
So you were talking about if Svidrigailov had someone who he could pity, who would have take pity on him. Mm-hmm. he could have ended up very differently.
Mhm.
So I guess my question is like, what is Junior's role in him? Like, could
Yeah.
she have provided empathy? Did she do something wrong in reacting the way she did? Is there any way that she could have sort of redeemed him by acting differently?
Well, okay, so I think that the way that Razumikin obviously the way that Razumikin approaches Junya is horribly wrong. Just like there's this, because sort of how you talked about it, like the corrupted form of love. He might be attracted to her, but that does not justify his actions. I don't think Junya owed anything to Svidrigailov in that situation. Is more of her protecting herself, which I think was more of her acting on the side of justice. But I don't necessarily think it would have been best in her situation to have compassion on him, because I don't think that he would have received it properly. Yeah.
So you said right at the beginning of the questions and answers part that you identified pity as a desire of sort of sorrow about people in a bad state, and compassion as acting on that pity and trying to do something about it.
Yeah.
I was just a bit confused because I thought that pity and compassion were sort of the same thing, because they're both desires. Pity is sort of a feeling about how set of sorrow because they've sinned and they're having regrets about it and want to change that. And then compassion is the feeling of wanting to do something, and then mercy as actually doing something. Because you can have compassion on someone, like we're having compassion on Raskolnikov, but we can't change anything that's happening to him or do anything about it.
Yeah, I would say, okay, so I think my definitions for mercy sort of, as we kept going, was sort of like came out more. I think I would say that pity is sort of, I think we wouldn't have compassion towards Raskolnikov in the sense that we aren't able to actively impact his life in a certain way. But we can have pity towards him because that's more of like that gut feeling, like when we see him struggling, like that's what we feel. Whereas compassion is more of, say, Sonia's role. And then mercy would be, I guess, sort of, if Raskolnikov had directly harmed somebody and then they have the authority to punish him in a certain way, and then they choose not to. If that makes sense.
All right.
All right. Thank you so much. This is beautifully done. Thank you.
Yeah.
These are
I think sort of the way that I was weighing justice and pity was just like whatever is most beneficial in that situation. There are certain instances where justice has to be served, and then there are certain instances where it might be more beneficial to give hope to that person.
Yeah, I'm wondering, like,
Thank you so much for everything.
Thank you.
Interesting. We actually talked about that in HL. We actually talked about that.
Thank you.
Wait, so